I want to thank all of you for being a part of these research seminars over the past year. Welcome to the CDDRL Weekly Research Seminar. It's officially the last one, the end of the spring quarter. I want to thank also, just take a quick moment before we get to our brilliant students. This is my last seminar as Associate Director for Research, and I want to thank Catherine Stoner, the Director of CDDRL, and our previous Director, Frank Fukuyama, for giving me this opportunity to serve in this role. It's been a really wonderful 4 years, a little bit strained by this silly pandemic, but otherwise, just a really wonderful way to think about what it means to foster a productive research environment. And so I wanted to take a quick note and acknowledge that when I first got to CDDRL almost a decade ago, the research seminars were really the main way you could engage with the community. I think that remains true today. But as a postdoc and a researcher, I enjoyed coming to the weekly seminars, particularly because they were a departure from the kind of workshop I had experienced in graduate school. Here, the emphasis really seemed to be on maximizing usefulness to the speaker and getting a variety of perspectives from the audience who come from different disciplinary and professional backgrounds. In that time, the past 9 years or so that I've been at Stanford, there's actually been a lot of empirical research on what academic seminars do. At best, academic workshops foster and enable rich and productive discussion. They facilitate a respectful exchange of ideas, and they sometimes have robust debate, but ones where at the end of the day, parties feel both heard and also have come away learning something. At worst, workshops can do something different. They can be hostile, especially to women and minorities. They can marginalize people and marginalize ideas. And they can also lead to some monopolization of time and space at the expense of others' voices. So here I've really tried to do the former rather than the latter. I hope that at CDDRL, we continue this tradition. I know that we will with my successor, Hisham Salem. We try to invite speakers on a range of topics who have come from as many different interdisciplinary backgrounds as possible who work on democracy development and rule of law. We prioritize as audience members, listening and learning and engaging respectfully. Sometimes this means my being a little bit rigid about things like time or who's asking questions, maintaining the list, et cetera. But I know that this is the spirit that Hisham will continue. And I hope that all of you who are leaving CDDRL, it's really a loss to our community to have to send people away after a year, including our pre and postdocs and visiting scholars. But I hope that you will take this spirit with you wherever you go, because workshops are an inevitable part of how we collaborate and engage as scholars. Thank you for allowing that sort of tangential soapbox. But I want
Bravo, bravo.
I'm so excited to welcome two of our just wonderful students. This is always one of my favorite sessions of the year. At Stanford, we have at CDDRL, the Fisher Family Honors Program and Democracy Development and Rule of Law. This is a selective interdisciplinary honors program where juniors apply and beginning their junior spring embark on a 1-year intensive research project that culminates in a senior thesis. We award 2 awards every year. The first is the Firestone Medal for Undergraduate Excellence, which goes to the top 10% of thesis winners. And we also award a CDDRL Outstanding Thesis Award. This year, we have 2 really phenomenal seniors who actually first expressed interest in CDDRL as sophomores. They were very earnest and on the ball. Tara Hein will be presenting first. She's our Firestone Medal winner. She's a political science major who undertook 10 weeks of field work in Chile. She's going to tell us all about it and has produced a really beautiful thesis on fragmented citizenship, which is a concept that I think we will all understand and really be able to use as social scientists. And also Sean Michael, winner of the CDDRL Outstanding Thesis Award, is an econ major with minors in modern languages and political science. He's heading to DC to work at BCG on public sector consulting, which he wants you to know is not private equity. And he has written a really beautiful thesis on plurinationalism in constitutions. We have a very Latin America heavy group of award winners this year. So the way we're going to organize things is Tara will speak for 20 minutes. Then we'll have time for Q&A, probably about 10 minutes or so. We will then go to Sean and have Q&A for him rather than pooling Q&A for both. Please don't interrupt, and we will save our questions for the end of each of their talks. Thank you so much, Tara and Sean. Tara, go ahead.
It's so wonderful to see all of you here and sort of give this presentation for a second time. For those of you who know me well, I talk about my thesis constantly, and I love doing so. So as Didi mentioned, I did my thesis on Chile, looking at citizenship. So as many of you might know, in 2019, there was massive social protests in Chile. Over 1 million people went to the streets of Santiago alone, and it was sort of considered the largest social outburst since the return of democracy 30 years ago. And it was basically this really sort of like mixed pool of demands, from indigenous rights to sort of like rights for women and minorities, and sort of also a demanding to reframe what it really meant to be a citizen in Chile. There was demands for better education, expanded pensions, and sort of really challenging the social contract in the country. And this is particularly the case for socially and economically vulnerable populations. So this is not people who are under the poverty line per se, but people who are still struggling to get by day to day and still are marginalized by this system. And so when I was looking at what to do for my thesis, I was really interested in this sort of push to rewrite the social contract in Chile, particularly from the perspective of these individuals who again, are sort of no longer poor. The poverty rate fell significantly since democracy returned in Chile, but there was still sort of this sense of marginalization and exclusion. So to start out, the first sort of endeavor of this thesis was trying to figure out what citizenship even is, right? It's a word that we hear a lot, and I think we often associate with sort of basic sort of legal status kind of items. So thinking about having a passport, being able to vote, but in a democracy, citizenship is so much more. It has to do with our general relationship to the state, and as this diagram shows, it's often mediated by our position in communities. And then in a democracy, participation is really key. And while this does happen at the polls, there are so many more like subtle and sort of daily ways that people are meant to engage with their political system. In terms of rights, there's this sort of classic distinction between civil, political, and social rights. We could talk about how useful that is. I think for here, it's sort of still this emblematic way of thinking about the way that rights are understood in democracies. So in Latin America specifically, there is very high inequality, as I'm sure many of you know, and state capacity is spotty. So while in some areas there is a strong state, in others there is sort of this deficient provision of public goods. So in a really wonderful paper, Inola Gonzalez looks at how deficient security provision, so like looking at police forces, and unequal security provision affect citizenship in the region. And she basically outlines two different sort of effects of this. One is constrained citizenship. So basically, if people don't feel safe leaving their homes, they're less likely to sort of engage in these daily democratic activities, and also sort of start withdrawing from not only the state, but other citizens as well. And then the second thing is, if you look at unequal security provision on a societal level, you get this idea of stratified citizenship, where even if you have sort of equality at the polls and daily life and interaction with sort of street level bureaucrats, there is still this continued exclusion and stratification that occurs. And a concept that I think is really useful to think about the presence of the state comes from this study on sort of citizen action and active citizenship in India. And the author basically proposes this idea that there is sort of this nice 2x2 of state breadth and regularity. And basically, I will make the case that Chile falls in this sort of D box of an intermediate state, where there is a lot of the state, but it's uneven in its delivery of services and its sort of presence across society. And so we sort of have this interesting sort of combination where there is a lot of the state to be seen, but it's just not equally accessible on a societal level. And as I found in my thesis, it's also not equally accessible within sort of the individual experience. So to answer my research question, I wanted to do qualitative research because I really wanted to understand how people understand their place in a democracy. When you look at what happened in 2019 in Chile, it was clearly sort of this frustration with the system. And it was also a very deliberate choice of how to engage in that democracy. Voter turnout has been falling in Chile, but protest has been rising over the last 15 years or so. And so I really wanted to sort of get a sense for how people see their place in a democracy. What do they expect from the state? And how do they sort of see their own responsibility in society as citizens? And within qualitative methods specifically, I selected grounded theory because it's sort of this approach to research that seeks to build theory based on empirical data. And so I think as social scientists, we're often trained to sort of think about having theory on one hand, sort of like how the world should be, and then sort of having empirical data on the other hand. And grounded theory kind of tries to bridge these two worlds by sort of saying that we can build theory very much rooted in sort of and so what this meant was that it was not hypothesis driven. This was focused on theory generation rather than theory testing. So for the research sites, these are the municipalities within the Santiago, the sort of greater Santiago area. And one of the sort of key principles of grounded theory is that you want to look for a unique site where you can investigate your question. And Puente Alto sort of worked in this sort of like check this box in two main ways, I would say. First, it is a municipality. They're called communes in Chile, so I'm going to be referring to it as a commune that has a very large sort of social housing project. This started during the dictatorship, but has continued throughout democracy, throughout the last 30 years of democratic rule. And it basically is this sort of this commune that has this characteristic of being socioeconomically vulnerable. So as we see with these like poverty like percentages, it's not the poorest area of Santiago. It's sort of this a little bit more upwardly mobile area. And it also sort of has this quality of having a lot of state interaction because a lot of people live in subsidized homes in this area. So we can talk a little bit more about this if we want to later in the questions. Basically, the idea was to get a very diverse sample to try to kind of include many different perspectives into the generation of theory. And so when I was going out for participant recruitment, the first step was sort of trying to find people based on their socioeconomic status and not their level of engagement in politics. So it was really important to me to find a recruitment strategy that would sort of work to get people who were more or less engaged in their democratic politics. And I started with street vendors in sort of the downtown area of this municipality, and sort of asked every fifth stall, invited the person to participate in this study, and then eventually started sort of branching out through NGOs and through the municipality to try to sort of incorporate new perspectives once I sort of felt like there was a sort of level of saturation with that first recruitment strategy, to try to get people who also worked outside of the municipality, people who were more engaged with municipal programs. We can talk more about this if you're interested. So then in terms of data analysis, I had 31 interviews, and I sort of started with a pilot set of 5, sort of looking at different themes and sort of topics that were coming up in those 5. Obviously, since I had conducted and transcribed the interviews, I was already intimately familiar with them. And through sort of this practice of writing memos and sort of reflecting on the interviews, by the time I got to the data analysis stage, I already had a pretty clear sense of what themes were coming up and what was sort of salient for participants. And another thing I should add, that part of grounded theory is also sort of an iterative process between data collection and data analysis. And so I sort of started this as I was conducting interviews in the summer. And then basically it was the process sort of consisted of condensing a lot of these codes into sort of larger overarching themes until ultimately reaching sort of the central theory. So there are 2 main sort of sets of findings. The first one sort of looks at what people think citizenship should be in its ideal form. And so this sort of is the expectations that people have of the state, what people would like to see, and how they sort of think of themselves as deserving agents, basically, in this system. And then, perhaps unsurprisingly, the second set of sort of findings looks at the lived experience that contrasts quite starkly with these ideal conceptions. And when analyzing this data, I used respondents' own definitions of citizenship for the analysis. So I sort of took that initial literature review of this social science ideal of what citizenship should be and kind of set it aside to look at what people thought citizenship should be. Okay, so looking at ideal conception, despite having done that, I found that people's definitions actually mapped on quite closely to the way that we would think of citizenship from the political science perspective. I think the main difference was that people didn't mention their legal status as much, but one of the selection criteria for participants was that they had to be legal citizens of Chile. And so I think maybe this wasn't as salient in their minds. Again, this is context specific, so it's important to keep that in mind. These are just some examples of how I sort of coded these different examples of what people consider to be key parts of citizenship. And I think, interesting component to this as well is that there was a local and a national dimension that people sort of included. So this idea of being a good neighbor or being a good mother, people would talk about sort of teaching their children to respect the public playground, and they considered this like a key part of their citizenship. And I think that's not something that comes up as much in sort of like the theory that I had looked at before. And so I think the key thing that starts to catch my eye as I am sort of comparing these two, these two sort of realms of ideals and lived experiences, is that while people have sort of a cohesive understanding of what citizenship should be in its ideal form, that's sort of like very tight and sort of collected, when people start talking about their lived experiences, a lot of this sort of gets set aside, I should say. And they kind of start pointing out both how these different elements are kind of disconnected, and also how within each of these, the degree to which that initial expectation is realized differs. So while, for example, many people mentioned voting as something that they felt was realized, other people talked about healthcare as being something that was consistently sort of disappointing them and unreliable. And so that's sort of what the different like shading represents here. So this is one like key vignette example that I think is really emblematic, which is of having, like, going back to the security example, one person could be afraid to leave her home, sort of worried that if she steps outside, her life will be at risk. And at the same time, she could be living in a subsidized home, sort of demonstrating an emblematic sort of achievement of having reached the state and having accessed her right as a citizen. And so this sort of leads me to the main finding, which is this idea that fragmented citizenship is this experience of having your citizenship realized to different degrees across different encounters with a state, or across these different dimensions of citizenship. And ultimately, I make the case that this is more likely to occur in intermediate states, in places where the state is really broad, but its ability to live up to all of these different facets is spotty at best. And so to conclude, I think it's just kind of a recap. So on the one hand, it's really important, I think, to think about how high the expectations were of these people that I interviewed, right? Of having housing, like healthcare, education as fundamental rights of their citizenship. And then on the other hand, sort of seeing a lot of the state and sort of having these expectations that the state could do better if it wanted to, but it's not doing that, right? And so I think ultimately we see that people sort of withdraw from spaces where they feel like their citizenship isn't being as realized, sort of resorting to private options or sort of withdrawing from the state, kind of the way that De Gonzalez argued with this idea of constrained citizenship. It's just that we see this play out differently in different spaces. And so that's basically the ultimate idea of fragmentation. Thank you so much.
Did we say who your advisors were?
Oh, no, my advisors were Beatrice Margoloni, Jeremy Weinstein, and informally,
We talked.
Mr.
All right, I'm going to take a list. If you have a question, go ahead and raise your hand. And Larry, did you have a question?
Yes, I did.
All right.
One of the things that's striking is that that was missing, I thought, from, not because you did not faithfully represent what you learned, but it seemed to be kind of underplayed from what you heard from them, was the political and civil libertarian dimension of rights. Their conception was more on social rights. And I think a message from this is that kind of a lot of this is like the air we breathe. We take it for granted unless it's kind of in question, like it is in New York. And so I'm wondering if you think, if you had done this in 1991, when there was a very kind of immediate memory of the dictatorship, how might the answers you got have been different?
Yes, I think they would have been totally different. I think in 2019, social rights were at the forefront of a lot of protesters' demands. And it is sort of the inflection point, I think, of these debates in Chile at the moment. I think there are two things to note. I think first, it's 100% context specific. But I think the second thing is that this concept could be applied. I think it's relative. I think it depends on what your initial set of expectations are, because again, I think this isn't meant to convey sort of an explicit reality, but it's more meant to convey sort of lived experiences and the way you make sense of those. And so I think, for example, if in the US you were to ask people and they would sort of say freedom of speech, like, I don't know, right to bear arms, and they would sort of mention these as sort of salient rights, I think you could still sort of see fragmentation playing out. It's just the sort of stage on which it does would differ. And yeah, I totally think that if you had done this after the dictatorship, the question would have been really different. I also think that in Chile, the state has become a lot more visible and a lot more capable over the last 30 years. And I think my study obviously can't talk to this because it's not sort of looking at this time difference, but I think that the rising expectations with sort of at this higher potential is almost what is sort of leading this to like a breaking point. Yeah.
All right, Catherine. I'm sorry, just to go by.
Oh, that won't stop. I'm just wondering how you think. So I had two questions. One is this citizenship? How is this citizenship as opposed to what we would call political culture and expectations of what the state is supposed to provide? So that is one. And the second is, how do you think the views would differ by class? Because you wanted to look at the socially vulnerable, so you chose not the poorest, but a poorer area. So are expectations too high or too low?
So I think why citizenship? I think one of the things, I think I wasn't fixated on citizenship when I started my thesis. I was more interested in sort of citizen-state relations in general. And I think citizenship is sort of a vehicle that I think doesn't get talked about enough in the context of democracy in this way, because I think it's more this idea of like what is required of you, right? And I think we talk about voting, but it's sort of this idea that there is, again, in a democracy, like there is so many other ways in which you're engaging with the state. And I think just by me asking people the question, like, what does it mean to be a citizen? And them saying like the right to housing, like that's like such a, it's a very clear response to this idea. And I think more broadly, it is political culture, right? But I think citizenship would sort of fall into that as opposed to being two separate things. And I think participation is like its own sort of field. And when I started, I was sort of thinking a little bit about looking at these as two separate entities. But I think for the sake of this, it was this idea that participation is a key part of citizenship, even if it also is so rich and you can also like, investigate that further. In terms of class, so I ended up sort of getting a little bit of variation within my sample, kind of on purpose, again, this idea of sort of getting different perspectives. And I think what I would be interested to see, and I would be interested to kind of pursue this further, is sort of take this to different classes. I think that with a lot of my advisors and from my data analysis, it kind of became clear that this is probably something that is experienced across social class, but your ability to mitigate it or deal with it is different. So if, let's say, let's assume like everyone thinks healthcare is a key like right of citizenship, but if the healthcare system is the public healthcare system is subpar and you have the resources to sort of buy out of it, it doesn't matter so much that key right of citizenship isn't being realized. Whereas if you don't have the resources, it's more burdensome. And so I think that's basically how the class aspect fits into this.
The list is Marisa, Brett, Tom, Dinsha, and Steve. Marisa?
So my impression of Chile, historically at least, or for a long time, maybe not so much recently, is very politicized. Like people were very identified with political parties, even in high school, they were members of political parties. And the political parties have infiltrated throughout society and the political system. And maybe political parties are one way that bring these different aspects together. They help defragment or unify these different aspects. So I was curious if political parties came up in any of your discussions with these citizens about what it means to be a citizen and how they connect to the state.
So two things. One, the long-term trend in Chile is that the trust in political parties, I'm pretty sure it's like single digits or like very low double digits. And that's part of the issue right now. One person that I spoke to was affiliated with a political party out of 31. Everyone else, I think it was much more sort of issue-based. I think right now there is no strong sort of like notion of like which party does what or like which party is actually there for you. I think a lot of people were sort of like harking back to this idea of like, I don't care what party they're from. Like, I just want them to be like there for like the poor, for us, right? And so I think like I think that's more the way that people are thinking about it right now. I think like parties have kind of lost a lot of their influence. That we can talk about that. That's also problematic, but it's a different issue.
Brett?
Yeah, this was super fascinating. And I also love this session every year. It's yeah, just super exciting. So thank you. So I was just curious whether in your interviews you sensed that kind of a particular kind or category of unrealized expectations were particularly associated in 2019 protests and might be especially likely to foster protests in the future.
Yeah, so I think it's shifted significantly. I think so. The proposed constitutional draft that was in process when I was there got rejected. And when that happened, I wasn't really surprised given the way my interviews went. So I think a lot of people were sort of reluctant to support the protests, just given the damage that they had caused. So thinking about like burnt out metro stations, for example, they were like, again, it's us, the poor, that are suffering these consequences. Like we are the people who need the metro to go to work, right? So it's sort of thinking about like how inequality is playing into it. I think social issues are definitely like one sort of strong point, but the other one is security. And if you look at this last most recent election for like a new constitutional, like a new sort of body to draft the new constitution, it's the far right that's promising to address security concerns, right? And so I think that like, if you look at it from sort of an issue based standpoint, it makes a lot of sense, right? Like I think like you do want healthcare, but you also want to be safe when you leave your home. And so I think it's just different sort of political sides that are sort of like latching on to these different needs that are being sort of, or that are unmet, I would say.
Tom?
So Tara, you've dedicated 2 years of your life to this research. It's a little different question. I'm curious about, I really like the grounded theory approach, especially given the topic. What lessons do you have about yourself as a researcher, given the fact that you did the research and devoted it? Was there any influences of having done the actual interviews that you have, positive or negative, on what you found?
Yes, I loved writing my thesis. I think there were, as my advisors can attest, there were moments where I think it was hard. I think like participant recruitment was really hard. I think it was hard. Like at one point we started doing like subway exit kind of work, and that was a new kind of experience, you know, to just yeah. But I think it's also like the level of like familiarity you gain with these transcripts, like also like the amount of time you just sit with it, you know. And I think the other thing that I really learned is like how much of a collaborative process this really is. Like you think you find something, you talk to your advisors, you have new questions, let's go back. Like it's really like it is iterative. And I think those conversations with other people is honestly what has made this work what it is, and sort of like shaped it into what it is. And I think that is a key sort of aspect of this for me. And also I think, you know, at the end of so many of my interviews, people were so grateful. You know, they were like, oh, thank you so much. Nobody's ever asked me what it means to be a citizen before. Like nobody has asked me this. And that to me, and like some people were like even saying like, oh, this was like a therapy session. Like, and I think like, you know, people need to be heard. And I think I was able to sort of make a little graphic distilling my thesis findings and share it back with respondents, and people were really happy with that. And I think it's just, yeah, I think that's kind of the biggest problem right now is people aren't being heard.
Dinsha?
It's hard to follow up after a question like that. But it is really interesting. You know, if you're right, who's wrong? This idea that citizenship is more than just identity. It's something about what they're receiving from the state. Why do you think that might be? Why do, like, for instance, if, I imagine, not that I've done anything like this anywhere else, but if I go like the US, it might be parties, or if I go to another country, it might be ethnic ties or something like that. Why do you think it's not really factoring up in these areas? Or do you think it would if we went somewhere else?
Like why are we not thinking about it through the lens of citizenship, or what do you mean? Like,
why is it seems like identity isn't what's being activated when people think about citizenship, it's rights, it's what the state is actually providing them.
I see what you're saying. I think it has to do very much with the national framing at the time. So in 2019, I mean, the fact that like 1/9 of the city was like on the streets, like I think is just emblematic of like how like it completely changed like the national discourse, right? And so I think when you're thinking about like the US, for example, where things are so split, I think like that is sort of like the way that leaders are talking, that is the way that people are activating sort of like political sentiment. It's sort of like identity politics, right? That's like what is being emphasized. And I think the movements in 2019, but also leading up to 2019, these sort of smaller movements are sort of working towards this idea of rights, right? And sort of pushing to change the national discourse in that way. And I think so. I think that's why it's kind of like a unique setting. And obviously, like ethnicity is a huge part of this. I interviewed Mapuche people who, for my interview, like I was very specific. Like this is not about Indigenous identity because it's a whole separate thesis, as we will soon hear about. And so I just had to set the scope somewhere. There are huge problems in Chile about ethnicity, right, and that sort of factor. So I think it's also just this happens to be one salient thing. I don't think that it's completely accurate to say that like ethnicity is not an issue. Like class is a huge issue also, right? Yeah, so I think that just has to do with like the social movement framing, I would say.
All right, Steve.
So one of the great things about the thesis is that because it's theory development, right, you can take what you've got and it's generating a series of hypotheses that you can go out and test in your next project. And so one of them that hasn't been picked up on is you're very clear several times in the presentation and the thesis of tying fragmented citizenship to that fourth box down below, where states' aspirations are broad, but their capacity is thin to deliver. And I just wanted to push back, wondering, really? I mean, you would not find, I mean, fragmented citizenship in the United States or fragmented citizenship in England or fragmented citizenship in France, right? Where you have states that have broad aspirations and have a lot more capacity.
So I think the US is an intermediate state. We can talk about that later. But I think you have to like have ideals. Ideals have to have a place somewhere, right? And I think when we think of like advanced welfare states, they tend to be this sort of ideal. And Scandinavia has its own set of issues, as we know. But I think like that's sort of like this paper, at least that I draw on, sort of sets Scandinavia on one end and then sort of Sudan on the other, right? And so it is maybe more thought of as a spectrum, right? But instead of a little 4 kind of unit box. But I think that when you look at sort of, maybe it's like a ratio, maybe you could think of like the degree to which a state is able to live up. And I think then there's just like a breaking point where you would say like people like here, like the majority of your sort of citizenship rights and sort of the elements of citizenship are being realized and on, whatever the cutting point is. So I think it is maybe more of a sliding scale, but I would say that this kind of fits the bar in many places. I think it's more also thinking about where the state is too narrow, right? And sort of thinking like, I don't think this would be the case. Like, I think there would be other issues at play if the state would be less capable and sort of less visible, right? So sort of thinking about the more like Sudan kind of leaning thing. I think there's like a whole, like, I wouldn't apply this concept there, if that makes sense.
All right, well, great job, Tara. We're so proud of this work. It's beautiful. Now, hang on, but we'll shuffle over here. Oh yeah, you don't have to really shuffle, but I follow this. That's right. And Sean's thesis advisor was Eric Jensen. Who's got it today?
Yes, he is out of town.
All right. Okay, you should be good.
Okay, all good?
Yeah, I think so.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Sean Michael, and my thesis is on comparing Indigenous autonomy in Plurinational, Colombia, and Bolivia. So to start off, I kind of want to take us back to February 2009. Evo Morales, the first Indigenous president of Bolivia, has recently been elected, and he's giving a speech on the new plurinational constitution of Bolivia. And this is what he says. In this plurinational constitution, the deepest aspirations of the portions of the population that have been the most abandoned, such as the workers and the indigenous movement, are consecrated. Here are consecrated in the new Bolivian constitution, these desires, these aspirations that have been so wished for and so put off. And now the new constitution of Bolivia is protecting equally of all Bolivians, no matter where they come from. And this is a pretty high promise to make, a very lofty promise, given the history of the region in terms of the protection of indigenous rights And I want to investigate in my thesis, basically, the extent to which he actually fulfills this promise. So my research question is, to what extent do plurinational constitutions enable indigenous groups to limit extractive projects within nominally autonomous lands? So for a quick table of contents, I want to walk us through the history of racial politics in Latin America and how that intersects with indigeneity, and then explain what plurinationalism is and how it can be implemented theoretically. I then want to go into my methodology for this thesis, and then give 2 quick spotlights of the case studies that I use. And finally, I want to conclude with some of the key weaknesses I've noticed from plurinational autonomy in my research, and then propose a reinforced plurinationalism that kind of speaks to a lot of those remedies. So first, let's go over the history of race and politics in Latin America. So as these countries in the region entered their independence eras, they had a really important opportunity ahead of them to create a national kind of myth and understanding that binds together all of these people from different ethnic backgrounds and traditional backgrounds. And in a lot of cases, countries in the region chose mestizaje, which is the symbolic recognition of the ethnic diversity of Afro-descendant, indigenous, and European descendant people in these countries. But in reality, it was very much an excuse or a cover for an European-centric whitening project in a lot of these countries. And that kind of system of political governance led to the systematic exclusion of indigenous people in those countries. And in the mid-20th century, as neoliberal economic policies were kind of taking hold in the region, austerity economics, for example, neoliberal multiculturalism emerged as kind of the prevailing way to think about race and politics in the region. You know, there's more kind of recognition of diversity by the state incrementally, but that recognition was limited and really only came as a means to an end, right? The idea that these states were pursuing extractive projects, I would embrace multiculturalism, but only when it didn't come into conflict with those extractive projects. So as kind of a point of departure from that, plurinationalism is was a radical idea that legally recognized the cultural and political differences of these indigenous groups as compared to the European descendant minorities that had led the political futures of those countries to that point. So now I want to explain in a little bit more detail what plurinationalism actually is. So adapting the work from Andrea Hale, who actually was a student at Stanford, plurinationalism is a model of statehood that defines nationality not as a single people with a single language and culture, but rather as a collection of people with diverse histories and cultures. So understanding that not only are there a large variety of different types of people with different traditions in these countries, but also that they contribute equally to the national development and the national stories of these countries. But in my thesis, I didn't really want to look into just how plurinationalism was defined, but rather how it actually shows up and is politically exercised. And in that way, I decided to research autonomous indigenous enclaves. In these plurinational countries, the sort of reparations for the centuries of political and economic exclusion of indigenous people was to grant rural government-recognized indigenous enclaves a certain level of fiscal, legal, and economic and cultural autonomy from the national state. You can see here in blue in Bolivia and the regions in orange in Colombia. But it wasn't guaranteed once this autonomy was written on paper that it would actually be implemented in a way that was very cohesive to the traditions of those groups. So I wanted to understand what the threats to indigenous autonomy were. So primarily, there's a kind of legal type of threat to indigenous autonomy. In a lot of these communities in the region, there's a form of customary indigenous law that is practiced and has been practiced for a very long time. Now, there can be a problem in terms of how to kind of find the boundaries between that customary law and Western law that's practiced in these nations. From an economic perspective, the region has a long history of extractivism from corporations, often abetted by the government, which we'll get into later. And those kind of forays into indigenous land can be a source of a threat to their autonomy. Additionally, illegal actors like guerrillas and paramilitaries can pose a very similar threat. And then politically, finally, there is a risk that central governments given that they are kind of in control of deciding who gets autonomy and how it is adjudicated, can kind of abstain or not really fulfill the responsibility to enact these laws once they're actually passed in their constitutions. So now I kind of want to get into my methodology. There we go. So I decided to use a mixed methods approach for my thesis. In short, I wanted to use quantitative data to establish a trend, then use qualitative data to kind of explain the reasons for why that trend exists. And my main issue in terms of finding a proxy for the implementation of plurinational autonomy was that I needed a variable that would be reliably measured in local areas across countries, and also would generally be correlated with the implementation of that autonomy. So I chose to use deforestation. You can see on the map on the right, it is a very well-measured data or variable across the region. And my kind of logic in choosing deforestation is that in the case that illegal groups or extractive economic activities are happening, for example, that deforestation would increase when these indigenous autonomies are violated in those areas. But after these indigenous groups file their complaints with the government, the idea is that deforestation would decrease 2 or 3 years after that complaint was filed, as the government fulfills its duty to push out those intrusive forces and let those communities have some form of autonomy. And the point is not to generalize and say that all indigenous groups in the region do not deforest or do not have any or perform any extractive economic activities, but rather that the illegal actors in government forces that would be infringing on their autonomy would be able to practice or deforest at a larger rate, and therefore relatively we would be able to see a decrease. I also decided to use a case study approach. One thing that I found in the literature was that there weren't really many papers comparing across countries, which I found very interesting. And I ended up deciding to use 2 case studies each in 2 of my countries. And the 2 countries I chose are Colombia and Bolivia. And my logic is as follows. I think that for reasons that I'll kind of get into in a little bit later, Colombia and Bolivia are the countries in the region that were most kind of poised to have a very robust regime of plurinational autonomy and have indigenous groups in those countries kind of flourish in those cases. So the logic here is that if plurinationalism can't really survive in the best of cases, then it's probably not a great framework to use in the not so great of cases. And I think that Colombia and Bolivia share a lot of similar or interesting similarities in terms of their political and ethnic kind of makeups that really made it really interesting to look into for my thesis. So to begin with, both of the plurinational constitutions in these countries in 1991 in Colombia and 2009 in Bolivia were the result of a popular uprisings against the state and a real crisis of state legitimacy. In Colombia, there were lots of protests about illegal groups and drug trafficking, whereas in Bolivia, there were lots of protests in the mid-2000s about indigenous rights and about control over indigenous lands. I think Colombia and Bolivia are also very interesting in that they're both very diverse ethnically. Colombia has a very wide mix of European descendant, indigenous, and Afro-descendant peoples, whereas Bolivia is also the most indigenous identified country in the region, according to a lot of reports. Economically, there are both sites of extractive activities, for example, gold mining in Colombia and tin and lithium mining in Bolivia that are likely to add to that deforestation, especially in indigenous lands. But actually, there are key differences that I thought would be really interesting in comparing these 2 countries. One is the Colombian Civil War and the kind of history of the Colombian state being quite weak and the proliferation of illegal groups like ELN on the left. And then Bolivia, the indigenous president, Evo Morales, which we'll get into later, posing his own kind of threat to the implementation of indigenous autonomy. So now I want to highlight one of my case studies in Carmatarua, Colombia. So Carmatarua is a village of about 2,000 Emberachami indigenous people in the municipality of Jardín in Antioquia in northern Colombia. The region is very much dependent on coffee production, and most of the villagers there practice or cultivate coffee in order to export it to other countries. And there's also a very long-running history of indigenous political representation and of indigenous political battles in that village. And one of the issues is that the village fell in the domain of ELN, one of the guerrilla groups in Colombia that routinely kind of murdered indigenous leaders in the village and would threaten their economic livelihoods. So in 2003 and 2005, or 2003 and 2004, a few years after the Plurinational Constitution, the villagers teamed up with the Indigenous Organization of Antioquia, the state-level indigenous political organization, to apply for titling as an ETI, or an autonomous indigenous entity. So we see on the left that in the years after Carmatarua applied for ETI status, that deforestation largely stayed lower than the national average for Colombia for those years. And I argue that this is kind of it's called institutional embeddedness, as Velasco Jaramillo puts it. And the reasons for this decrease in deforestation, I find, are multifold. For one, in the years after the 1991 Constitution, there was a lot of confusion as to how kind of the legal interplay between Western law and customary law would work. And in 1993, Colombia established the Independent Constitutional Court to adjudicate these issues. The Constitutional Court was really helpful for the village because it had, for years and years, issued rulings that kind of clarified the boundaries between indigenous law and positive law, which is Western law. And additionally, the village was able to rely on a really supportive municipal and regional level government. So it was actually able to have office space in the municipal capital and actually in the regional capital of Medellin in order for indigenous political leaders from the village to actually advocate for their village's best policies in the government, which was really helpful. And as a result of that kind of support from the state, the villagers of Carmatarua were able to basically create a legal code for their village that integrated Western and customary law, start agricultural projects that would irrigate their lands, and start health programs that provided healthcare to the villagers that otherwise would not have been there. So I argue that this institutional embeddedness is peak autonomy in the sense that the villagers were able to work hand in hand with multiple levels of government, local and state, in order to achieve their goals and push away forces like ELN. Okay, now let's move on to Ipicaguazu in Bolivia, which is a case that did not turn out so positively. So Ipicaguazu is a region in El Chaco in Bolivia, which is known for its kind of vast savannas and abundant natural gas reserves. And it is a village that had been the site of a natural gas factory in 2003. So in that year, the Spanish firm Repsol decided to construct the Margarita gas field in that area. And the Margarita gas field right here was clearly a huge kind of just posed a lot of destruction to lands that were formerly indigenous. So the villagers' leaders basically filed a complaint in 2004. As I spoke about earlier, in 2005, Evo Morales was elected as the first, indigenous president of Bolivia. So the villagers were very hopeful that kind of his administration would propel their claim and their complaints and accept it. In fact, he actually did the opposite. Morales rejected the complaint altogether and went further, claiming that the villagers of Ipicaguazu were actually, quote, the biggest threat to Colombia's or to Bolivia's energy development. So instead of taking a pro-indigenous approach as he was kind of expected to, he took a very anti-indigenous approach and actually let Repsol continue the construction for the gas field. In 2009, there was the Plurinational Constitution, and kind of as a result of this, the villagers thought that they can kind of get a second chance at fighting for their autonomy. So they start the titling process the same year to be designated as an autonomous indigenous enclave. But in 2010, they discovered that the Bolivian government, headed by Morales, had actually signed a deal with Repsol, permitting it to develop its gas field on indigenous lands, even though it was going to be titled as autonomous. They also found that the government had systematically been slowing down the approval of these titling process for TCOs across the country in order to advance extractive projects on those lands. So really perturbed by this, the villagers actually decided to sidestep the government altogether and signed a direct agreement with Repsol, the Spanish energy giants, that designated the villagers as the owners of the land and setting up a $15 million investment fund donated by Repsol to help with village services. And this is kind of what I describe as unstable autonomy in the state, in the sense that the state kind of abdicated its responsibility to protect these indigenous people. So instead, they had to sidestep it and negotiate with companies directly. The issue with this, there are many issues with this. One of them is that Repsol was not really in a position to to dictate who owned the land to begin with. So you kind of end up entering into this very weird legal gray area where the village is claiming that Repsol is able to give it these rights, whereas legally it's the government whose sole responsibility it is to do so. And also the village ended up being very kind of torn up by this decision. It's quite radical, and it ended up splitting up into two different factions politically, one that was pro-agreement and one that was anti-agreement. So you can see here that there were lots of kind of political repercussions as a result of the Bolivian state's abdication of its responsibility. So now I want to conclude with my findings. Kind of the 5 key weaknesses of plurinational autonomy that I found in my research were the political division within indigenous communities, the use of anti-indigenous tropes in national politics along the lines of what Evo Morales did, unclear legal boundaries between customary and Western law, the uneven support of national level indigenous organizations, and kind of the ability of indigenous organizations to bring forth complaints and publicize complaints from very small groups, and then vulnerable bureaucratic processes. And I think one of the key lessons from this is that these kind of factors are not operating in isolation. For example, in the Itikaguasu case, we found that the Morales administration was able to use anti-indigenous tropes to justify taking advantage of vulnerable bureaucratic processes for the titling agreement, and then also sowing division within those indigenous communities. So I feel like all of these kind of factors have some interplay between them. So as kind of a result of the research that I did and the weaknesses that I found, I proposed reinforced plurinationalism, which has 3 main factors. The first is coherent legal boundaries. I think to be able to find legal boundaries between customary, indigenous, and positive law is really important. For example, having a constitutional court that's independent and robust along the lines of what Colombia had is very important, and also to have a clear delineation of legal interplay between those two legal systems. And secondly, there's also the inclusion of indigenous organizations and fostering kind of connections between those organizations and individual communities, such that a village of 2,000 people like Carmatarua is able to bring its complaint to the municipal, regional, and national level and have that complaint heard. And then thirdly, having complaint processes in place once the titling process is ended, and having a separate body for the adjudication of those complaints, such that they're not vulnerable to political manipulations along the lines of what we saw in Bolivia. So yeah, that was my presentation. Thanks.
All right, any questions, Marisa?
Oh yeah.
You want me to start?
Yeah, please.
So I have 2 questions, actually. One is, forgive me, but I'm just curious why you didn't study Ecuador as well, because it does have a plurinational constitution. So how, if you had considered that at all and why you thought not to. And then the second question was about the choice of the town in Bolivia. So the Chaco regions, that's the lowlands, right? So wasn't Evo Morales' support from the higher regions and the indigenous, like when I think of Bolivia, I think of the indigenous in the higher regions, not this Chaco region. The Chaco region was his opponents. Do you think that played into this?
Yeah.
This?
Yeah. So to your first question, If I had more time, I would have chosen more countries to do case studies on. I originally planned to do Mexico and Ecuador in addition to Bolivia and Colombia, but Dee and Steve, they persuaded me otherwise. But I think that Ecuador is a really interesting case study as well. I would also say in Bolivia that highland lowland politics definitely played a role, particularly in the Ipico-Guasu case. As you said, Morales was a highland indigenous, or from the highland indigenous community. And a lot of his political posturing as a pro-indigenous leader was very much pro-highland indigenous groups. So he kind of proposed or popularized a very kind of narrow vision of what a good indigenous person in Bolivia was like. And funnily enough, it looked very similar to what the average highland indigenous person in Bolivia looked like. So I think that there's, and I discussed this more in my thesis, but there was a lot of political tension in terms of highland versus lowland communities, and also and the extent to which Morales was able to politicize those differences and weaponize them to turn the Bolivian community, or Bolivians generally, against people like the villagers of Ipico-Guasu. So I think highland lowland divides were a very big role in the Bolivian case.
Okay. Jamie?
Thanks so much. This is completely fascinating. I wanted to ask you to dig a little bit more into the divisions within communities. Intriguingly put out there, we didn't have much time to talk about. Was that primarily like Morales versus the communities, or interregional, or was there a lot within local areas themselves?
Yeah, so I think I'll speak to one of the case studies that I didn't actually cover in my presentation, which is Tipnis in Bolivia as well. So just to give a vignette, it was a park area that the government was proposing to build a road through, and it was also labeled as autonomous indigenous territory. But even within that region, it was a lowland region, by the way. There were lowland indigenous people who had been there for hundreds of years, in addition to highland colonizers who had come and were still indigenous, but had come from other regions, 50, 60 years before to grow cash crops. And in addition to that, there were also mestizo, non-indigenous people who were coming into the park as big landowners. So even within those divides and within the lowland indigenous groups in the park generally, there was a lot of division as to who was pro-road, who was anti-road. And even within that, the extent to which, oh, okay, are we going to cancel the road altogether or renegotiate with the government? So while I didn't have a lot of time to talk about it in my presentation, particularly in Bolivia, within community kind of polarization and division from a political perspective was definitely something that the Morales administration was able to take advantage of to suit its own political goals. And to your earlier question, propel and forward that kind of very narrow idea of a good indigenous person that was also in favor of a lot of the extractive developments that the Morales administration was in support of at the same time. So it really depended on who you were, where you were located, and whether you were in favor of the Morales administration's political and economic goals.
If there are any other questions, raise your hand. But in the meantime, I have one, which is about the future of plurinationalism. This was a concept that you brought to the honors program, and you have done such amazing research on it. And it was, it seems like such an important issue in Latin America. But there was a recent New Yorker article about how the fastest growing group of people are people who identify as indigenous. And that self-identification number has gone way up. But the global community is very divided on how to actually redress grievances of indigenous communities, or what counts as sort of successful recognition or reparation. Do you think plurinationalism is a concept that's gaining steam outside of Latin America, and you have really wonderful recommendations for how to strengthen it? Do you think that that is the kind of thing governments are considering? Yeah, I think that two things. To start with, I think that even plurinationalism as it was conceived of in Latin America and as I researched it, is very much a rural-centric idea of indigeneity. Indigenous people who are living in urban areas were very much not considered in this political process. So to that degree, it's kind of hard to present plurinationalism as a framework for all indigenous people around the world, just because it was even divided within its original region in terms of who it actually covered. I would say that one of the inspirations for my thesis, or kind of an intellectual side thought, was understanding as a Black man in America, the extent to which plurinationalism could be used or adapted in the US context to kind of address racial grievances
particularly post 2016. And I would say that in its current form, plurinationalism is probably not ready to be exported to other regions. But I would say that in the case that it kind of is passed constitutionally, along with the package of reforms I suggested in my thesis, I would be much more confident exporting it to or using it or a derivative of it in places like sub-Saharan Africa with immense economic diversity. But I wouldn't use it as a blanket solution for Indigenous people across the world.
Are there any other questions? Tom?
I have a question about the Colombia slide that you had, because it looked like all the data kind of conformed with your conclusion was except for 2011.
Yeah.
Do you know what was going on there? What happened? Why in that 1 year was it so different?
Yeah, I think that in 2011, this is not something that my research directly covers, but I think in 2011, there were a lot of issues with the resurgence of illegal groups, particularly of paramilitaries, because negotiations were kind of ongoing between the government and those groups to demilitarize. And I think that 2011 was a spike in the activities of illegal groups, such as paramilitaries, such as David, for example. So not the direct focus of my research, but that's something I found kind of tangential.
All right, Larry.
So this is also kind of taking you beyond a bit, but this is all unfolding in a context of democratic retreat, tension, ambiguity, some say backsliding, hopes for forward sliding. Did you get any, did you glean any kind of insights or conclusions about how these issues you were looking at were intersecting with the kind of broader macro struggle to re-equilibrate democracy in Bolivia?
Oh, in Bolivia particularly? Yeah, I think that the recognition after the Morales years, after he was ousted in 2019, I believe, that he was not kind of the bringer of all democratic norms and pro-Indigenous policies for everybody, particularly among everyday Bolivians. That, like in a macro context, I think that it made people, I don't know, more realize the extent to which their democracy had eroded. But I do also think that there's a lot of polarization. Even now, there are lots of people who are very much for him, pro the extractive policies, just because it means national development in a very traditional sense. So I think that there's generally been more of a reckoning with the idea that the Morales years were not everything that he chalked them up to be. But I think that the level of political polarization in the country means that realization is kind of taking place at slower paces and faster paces, depending on your allegiance to Morales.
Marcel.
Oh, right, okay. I just want to react to something you said just now.
Yeah.
On extending this plurinationalism to Africa, and I immediately thought about Ethiopia, which was exactly what you said would be a good idea, or maybe something to consider, which is to do, they divided the country into federal entities that are defined along ethnic lines.
Yes.
And it's the wars. So and to the rise of basically ethnic nationalism within each of these, within some of these, several of these entities, the Tigray, the Amhara, the Oromo, their borders, and basically nationalistic sentiments who attacked in the Amhara region. Of course, Tigray attacked the central government, like over and but it isn't. It was not exactly, I would say, a very successful endeavor. Would have been because, and also there were lots of people who don't belong exclusively to one group. It was like exactly Yugoslavia broke apart. So what about all the people who are,
in the middle?
In the middle.
Yeah, I think that starting with why plurinationalism was kind of implemented in the first place in the countries that I studied, I feel like it came from a very widespread general dissatisfaction and agreement among multiple kind of levels of society that something needed to change. And I would say that the key difference between these cases and Ethiopia would be that it seems like I mean, to my knowledge, that the Oromians generally don't want to kind of have power wrested out of their hands. And I would say that there's kind of less general agreement in Ethiopia that something along the lines of plurinationalism would be feasible, given that it's one ethnic group that has so much power over all the others from a political perspective. So I don't really think that, given Ethiopia's history and the recent political developments, that it would be a suitable place for plurinationalism as it stands, if that answers your question.
Catherine?
All right, I'm gonna really throw a curveball to get you ready
Never
for
done that
PG.
I'm excited.
I'm gonna invoke this word, Canada. People are gonna laugh, but it is a plurinational state, and in fact, it's actually quite a strong one. It's worked quite well. Okay, depends on your perspective.
Yeah.
And the other I'm going to throw in is New Zealand.
Mhm.
And the New Zealanders absolutely pride themselves on
being inclusive.
being inclusive and celebrating Maoris in particular. Canada obviously has a slightly different approach, absolutely atrocious behavior toward Indigenous people. But then, and this may yet happen if Indigenous communities are more and more infringed upon, especially through extractive industries, right? Their land is taken. In the last 30 years, actually, and this is a good case of correlation and causation not running together, since I've left the country. People have become, far better organized. And so their land claims have really been strongly litigated and protected in the courts in the way that they weren't 50 years ago. So, I mean, are there lessons there, do you think? Is it just that this is still, I mean, you're talking about a 1991 constitution, but another one much more recent.
Yeah.
So maybe there's a time element here.
Yeah, I think that
Those cases.
this may not be directly answering your question, but I do think that, to the point about rural versus urban Indigenous people, the kind of political organization and power of Indigenous groups had played a really large role in my case study countries in terms of pushing, making plurinationalism something that was widely considered at all, and then actually getting it over the finish line. I think that, like, national level organizations that were Indigenous centric in Colombia and Bolivia were both very helpful to that extent. So I think that it could be that in Canada, the kind of more cohesive political organization of Indigenous groups makes it such that people recognize those claims more versus 50 years ago. But I also think that process is very, it's procedural, and it's also very intentional, deciding who gets to be Indigenous, what types of claims should be kind of addressed by the government directly versus settled within communities. So I would probably posit that Canada has faced recently something along the lines of what Bolivia and Colombia have experienced in like the 70s and 80s in Colombia, and then in the 90s and 2000s in Bolivia, where you see this kind of recognition of Indigenous culture and the formation of groups to specifically advocate for those policies politically, such that a broader audience can understand this is what an Indigenous person looks like, and this is kind of the type of reparations that they're looking for on a broader scale.
All right, well, congratulations to these students, and thank you to our community. Thank you for these awesome questions and for your wonderful engagement. Just great job overall, everyone here.